Thank you for coming. So we have apologies from Steve Hassel and Phil
and Alistair Davis, IP.
Okay. Any late items? Any declarations of interest? Right, minutes of the meetings. Anyone want to agree that?
Yeah.
Literally what we get between you and Tim. Good. Item number 5. Is anyone handling that?
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So as usual, this is the standing item on the Standards Committee agenda, your forward plan for both the remainder of this municipal year, but also allows you to plan items that you would like to see brought to the meetings at in the next municipal year as well. Obviously, items can be put forward for consideration by yourself as the chair at any time, or by any other committee member simply through the chair. But this is your regular opportunity to make any suggestions for items you'd like to see brought forward to future meetings. The only couple of things on our forward plan that are yet to be scheduled, and I would perhaps suggest is brought to the March meeting. The committee routinely works through the various codes and protocols that you are responsible for overseeing. The one that hasn't been reviewed in the longest period of time is our guidance on councillor safety, lone working and online communications. That was last reviewed by the committee in March 2025, so still relatively recently, and I wouldn't suggest that the policy is substantially out of date. However, I think it's good practice to bring it back on a reasonably regular basis for any comments or updates. And then secondly, another outstanding action is the 12-month review of the effectiveness of changes that were introduced in autumn 2024 to improve the visibility of outcomes from the standards process, and also the process for agreeing and documenting informal resolutions to complaints. So those arrangements have now been in place for a little over a year, and there's an opportunity to bring those back and just discuss how effective they've been in achieving those stated aims. Obviously, there's an opportunity now for any members of the committee to suggest other items that you might want to see brought forward by ourselves as officers.
Yeah, okay, I think Councillor Hudson's got something.
I'm going to bring something into the mix, and I've spoken with you, Emily and Alex, about it in the past. Say a complaint was put in by a councillor and it was just instantly thrown out and nothing actually moved forward with anything. Should the councillor actually be told about that? Is that some... Councillors have discussed this thing over the years, that you don't know what conversations are going off, you don't know the complaints necessarily what have come in and just been completely dismissed. Should the councillor actually be told? I do think at some point that does need to be looked at.
If it's raised as in any way as a complaint that we would consider fell within the legislative definition of a complaint, then you would be told about it, because we have to process it in accordance with our procedures. So it would be, we would deal with it, the IPs would be informed, you would be informed as the councillor subject. So it would only be if in a situation where maybe someone contacted us and said, I'm thinking of making a complaint against a councillor, can you tell me how to do it effectively? And then they didn't submit anything. And we do sometimes get that, where someone may contact us and we say, well, because they want us to do something, they want the council to take action. We can't always take action, so sometimes we say to them, well, the way you have approached this is not the way that doesn't allow us to do anything. So if you want to raise this formally, this is the standards complaint process. But we don't, in those things, we don't normally know any information. We haven't got permission to share data at that point. So I think it would be quite tricky. Whereas once they get into the standards process, then you're always informed anyway.
Is that always informed even if it's something's not quite relevant, or if do you screen the complaints forms at all? You know what I mean? It may be completely just not right.
If they haven't filled in sufficient information for us to be able to progress the complaint, and they aren't willing to provide any more information to allow us to take it forward, then we would dismiss it in those circumstances. But again, that suggests there's nothing substantive to inform about. Once they've, but we apply a very low bar to what constitutes a complaint on the form. Sometimes the forms are not particularly well populated, are they, Alex?
No, that's correct. And I think the only example I can point to recently is that we had a series, the complaints form was completed several times by the same individual. And those complaints were spurious, and if I'm being honest, clearly were being submitted by someone who wasn't particularly well, I don't think. And in those circumstances, we did still alert the councillor who was the subject of the complaint, and the outcome that arose from that was it wasn't treated as a standards complaint, and actually there was an intervention by our local area coordinators around that individual. But I think in any circumstances where a concern, as Emily's explained, when a formal complaint is brought, one of the first steps in the procedure is that the subject member is notified, because they are then invited to provide their response, their initial response, and that after that it's then shared with the IPs. But I can't think of any other instances where complaints have been made either informally or formally, and the councillor hasn't been made aware.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, from what we were discussing before, I mean, Councillor Hudson was saying that he knows of 2 complaints made against him, but was not informed. Now, there's a difference between somebody not filling the form incorrectly or whatever, but if a complaint was made against Richard or Tim or myself for that matter, regardless of what the sort of you or the sort of independents decide, should the councillor be informed if they haven't been so at the start of it? What I guess what I'm trying to say, we were trying to sort of gauge what Richard was saying, and from what he was saying, that 2 complaints were made against him from people he knows. They told him, but he was not notified by any sort of body from the standards committee.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, there's your hand up.
We're straying into the debate actually of the old topic.
I would say what Emily said is correct. I mean, if they make a formal complaint, then we'll hear about it. If they don't make a complaint, I'm sure it's just like gossip, isn't it? It's like
I think with
talking on the internet.
What you've said kind of makes sense, but you may have a specific instance. So if
members of this committee might know this information, but your average councillor is not actually going to know. And when I'm discussing this topic with other councillors, it's like there's an air of paranoia, because nobody seems to know what we might know this information, but other councillors do not know what is actually going off behind their back or what conversations are happening.
Well, they should know. They should be told that that's the process.
The process is easy enough. People should know. If you've got or think you've had a particular problem, it might be worth trying to find out the exact circumstances of that, and then we may bring it back. Because if it has happened, we need to find out how it's happened or what's happened, and then we'll maybe look at it if we think it's worth going forward. Because I think what Emily and
park it for now. Then.
Yeah, I think what's been said is fine. But then something may have slipped through the net is what I'm trying to say. I'm not going to discount it outright, but it sounds like we don't.
I think there is. I think the danger of trying to deal with this in the context of standards is that the standards committee deals with our standards processes and our associated codes, and is something that is codified because it relates to something which amounts to a complaint, so a standards complaint. Obviously, there is work that we do as DEM services officers and the monitoring officer, etc., that is handling that interaction between members of the public and our councillors, providing a bit of a buffer as well, I would say, in that regard. They aren't things that they aren't formal complaints, so they're not covered by a process. Yes. I think if we try and codify them, we almost turn them into complaints when they're not.
Sorry. Can I just say that, if you have a suspicion a complaint has been made or might have been made, can't you just ask the monitoring officer if that's the case? And if there was perhaps a complaint that wasn't a formal complaint.
I think in this case there was no
suspicion. Well, something happened. It wasn't a complaint.
Nothing known at the time, so I think that's quite tricky.
I think there's 2 ways of looking at this, Chair. One, what Emily and Alex has said is completely true. And that's when, before they came and Councillor Hudson mentioned it to me, I asked him if he had been contacted in the first instance. So I guess if he had been contacted in the first instance, then you would have told him about the complaint, right? But if somebody just comes up to you and says, I've made a complaint about you, you know, how do you know? And precisely if you was, the gentleman said, if you was that worried, you should ask Alex or Emily, but can't just sort of say, well, there was complaints against me. But the way you put it, I thought it was something that somebody had written, you know, to me. But if somebody just says to you, well, I made a complaint about you, and Emily or Alex don't know about it, I mean, they, you know, they're not likely to come and contact you.
Consciously keen to move on, Chair.
Yeah, that's all right.
I think there are, you know, there are many circumstances I could imagine where a member of the public might believe they have made a complaint, because there are many ways to approach the council. So, you know, if something has happened in your ward and perhaps they have said something to a neighbourhood officer at a, you know, a neighbourhood forum or whatever it might be, they might legitimately believe that they have made a complaint. Now, it might not necessarily be the case that our neighbourhood officers would then come and speak to Emily and I, or log it as a standards complaint, as it were. So I think, you know, I can well imagine situations in which maybe something has happened in the ward where someone has said to you, I have made a complaint, when actually they've not followed the procedures that we as a
sounds like that might be the case. Yeah. Anything else on that forward plan? Number 6, the government response to the consultation.
Thank you, Chair. That one is me again. Before Christmas, I think at the last meeting of the committee, in fact, I confidently informed you all that we weren't expecting the government's response to the consultation on the standards framework anytime soon. And lo and behold, shortly afterwards, the government published their response to the consultation that took place in around 12 months previously. So the report that's on the agenda provides an update to the committee on how the government has responded to that consultation on strengthening the standards and conduct framework for local authorities in England. The consultation closed on 26th of February 2025, and the Standards Committee considered the Council's responses at its meetings held in January and March of that year. So I intend to just briefly summarise some of the key themes arising from the government's response, and obviously provide an opportunity for the committee to note and comment on some of the wider implications for our local standards arrangements. The consultation received around 2,000 responses, and they are responses from stakeholders across the sector. So they are councils as corporate bodies, local councillors. It was open to the public as well, I believe. So people who perhaps have used standards procedures in their local authority as well. But I think the sort of broadest theme that emerged from the consultation and reflects, I think, the view that Derby submitted was that the current standards regime, as it's established under the Localism Act 2011, wasn't fit for purpose. And the government's stated intention when they launched the consultation was to strengthen the sanctions that could be applied via local authority standards procedures, whilst introducing appropriate safeguards for councillors when dealing with those stronger sanctions as well. Things that stood out perhaps for myself in that consultation was around recognition from the government around the importance of the standards framework as a means to support a positive organisational culture. I think it shouldn't be underestimated how important it is to the functioning of the local authority that officers and councillors have respectful relationships and effective relationships. Likewise, that in terms of the council's reputation as a democratic organisation, that councillors' interactions with the public they represent are respectful and appropriate. There was a recognition in the consultation responses that poor conduct can undermine the governance of the council and also cause distress to those officers, councillors or members of the public who are subject to poor behaviour. I think the other thing that I took from the response was that emphasising that space for maintaining a space for robust political debate, whilst also reinforcing those expectations around respectful behaviour. I don't think these proposals are designed to limit councillors' abilities to exercise their rights to free speech in political forums. It's about ensuring that behaviours are consistent with delivering high quality public services and representing residents effectively. A theme that we've obviously discussed considerably through this committee in the last sort of 2 to 3 years is around online conduct. And I think the consultation acknowledged the increasing impact of social media and online behaviour in driving a lot of complaints. And I think that's represented in the data that we see come before the committee in terms of the volume of our complaints that have an element of linked to social media activity. And whilst there was no explicit proposals around how poor conduct online was intended to be tackled, I think that a mandatory minimum code of conduct and clarification about when the code of conduct does and doesn't apply is important in tackling some of those issues around online conduct, because a lot of them arise in circumstances where perhaps a subject member doesn't believe they're acting in their capacity as a councillor, but are publishing information whilst their profile details them as being elected to Derby City Council. So to go through the reforms that have been proposed within the consultation response, a key one is the introduction of a mandatory minimum code of conduct for all local authorities that embed the 7 principles of public life. To some extent that takes place already. All codes of conduct are required to reflect the Nolan principles. And the Local Government Association did several years ago introduce a model code of conduct, but that model code isn't mandatory. And I think it's proposed that there will be a mandatory minimum code that councils can then add to suit their local circumstances. There will be the government intends to have a requirement for members to cooperate with standards investigations. There are examples, thankfully, from other local authorities of councillors who've sought to frustrate, the investigatory process into poor behaviour, and I think the government are seeking to embed a requirement for members to cooperate with investigations into poor behaviour. It might come as a surprise, but councils aren't currently required to constitute a standards committee. Councils are required to have a code of conduct, and they are required to have procedures for assessing complaints, but they're not currently required to have a standards committee for that purpose. And the government's proposals are to require that. Clearly, in our case, we've had a standards committee for a long time, and many upper-tier authorities in particular maintain a form of standards committee or have the standards committee rolled into the terms of reference of perhaps the Audit and Governance Committee or something equivalent to that. There is an expectation that standards committees will determine investigation outcomes and apply sanctions. Again, that is currently the case in Derby's existing procedures. And there is also a suggestion that voting rights will be provided for co-opted or independent members of the committee, and also with the suggestion that the chair of standards committees are chaired by an independent person. There are some further proposals contained within the government's response that some of them were expected and some of them were not. So there is an expectation of mandatory publication of all investigation outcomes, including when councillors have been exonerated, and also where a councillor might have stood down during the course of an investigation. So even in those circumstances, the outcome of investigations would be published. I think that reflects some of the changes that this committee agreed back in autumn of 2024. So it's good to see that codified in the national legislation. An interesting one that perhaps wasn't anticipated is, the government's response was fairly non-specific, but around issuing best practice guidance for councils to support those affected by councillor misconduct. So that might be other councillors, council officers, or members of the public. I think from our perspective as officers, it would be interesting to see what the government have in mind there in terms of what they expect to see in terms of practice, and how we might support those individuals who have been the subject of poor behaviour. Perhaps the most significant changes and ones that would return the standards regime to something akin to what it looked like prior to 2011 are new powers that would allow for the suspension of councillors for serious or repeated breaches for periods of up to 6 months. They are also looking at provision for interim suspensions in particularly serious cases. So, for example, maybe where a councillor was subject to a criminal investigation, standards committees would also be given the power to routinely review those suspensions to ensure they remain appropriate. And then perhaps the most serious consequence of these reforms would be the introduction of a disqualification criteria where a member is suspended twice within a 5-year period. So they would become ineligible to continue to stand as a councillor. Now, that is obviously quite a significant step, and I'm sure safeguards will be included in the legislation to ensure that decisions of that type wouldn't be taken lightly. And key to that would be the introduction of not only a local review for standards, a local review process for standards outcomes, but also a national appeals mechanism in that circumstance that may introduce something equivalent to the Standards Board for England that previously existed. I think key points to note in summary are that many aspects of this council's discretionary arrangements will be made mandatory under the proposals. My view is that we're in a reasonably healthy position in terms of how our arrangements reflect what the government is intending to do. Clearly, there will be significant changes required around those more significant sanctions that they are considering introducing. These reforms will require primary legislation and parliamentary time. So at this point in time, unclear timescales for introduction. And I think the key thing, and something I know that we've discussed, Chair, is around the interaction with local government reform. It's likely these changes are likely to take effect around the time that we'll be thinking about establishing standards regimes for newly created councils that could come into effect from 2028. So there'll clearly be an interaction there. But it's something for this committee to keep a watching brief on over the next sort of 18 months to 2 years. And I think broadly speaking, the consultation demonstrated, that the ability of councils to tackle serious misconduct was welcome, but with that comes significant complexity and potentially cost in terms of administering those arrangements for councils, so they will need to be introduced carefully. The committee is invited to note the government's consultation response and obviously comment on the proposed reforms and any implications for the council's existing standards procedures, and Emily and I are happy to answer any questions as far as we to the greatest extent of our knowledge at the present time.
Well done for speeding through that. So we think the odds of it happening under a Derby City Council banner are pretty slim. Is that the result of that?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Anybody want to say anything on the subject? Okay. I mean, I think most of them would welcome it, to be honest. There's quite a lot of good changes in there. Yeah, I mean, it'd be good to see, I think, mostly. So, fine. Right, number 7. So the review process to the monitoring officer, is that you, Emily?
Yes. So thank you, Chair. Item 7 is a report which has been requested by the Standard Committee at its meeting in August last year, when members may recall you considered a referral from the monitoring officer relating to potential member interference in a taxi licensing matter. During that discussion, members of committee identified an inconsistency between the established process for taxi licensing referrals and the wider process for monitoring officer referrals under the councillor complaints procedure, where a referral can be made by the monitoring officer into the standards committee for consideration where no formal complaint has been received. The purpose of this report is to clarify the current process for reporting dealing with instances of member interference in taxi licensing, and to seek committee steer on whether that process should be aligned with the broader monitoring officer referral provisions. So just by way of background, the taxi licensing process originates in the 2016 public interest report, which was issued by the then councillors, then external auditors. That report considered, amongst other issues, taxi licensing, and the council subsequently adopted an action plan which required serious instances of member interference to be reported to the Standards Committee. Subsequent to that, the Code of Conduct was amended to make clear that improper influencing in taxi licensing matters would constitute a breach of the code. So the current practice is that all member contact with licensing service is logged, and that's just a routine. But only matters raising a concern are escalated to either myself or legal services. But to be absolutely clear, this process is not in any way intended to prevent councillors from raising reasonable queries with the licensing service, to recognise that is a legitimate part of casework. It's only intended to capture those instances where councillor conduct has potentially breached the relevant provisions of the Code of Conduct in terms of the manner of that interaction. The process allows low-level issues to be addressed proportionately and promptly when a concern is raised without engaging the full standards process, because quite often it can be a relatively low-level matter relating to tone or the manner in which that interaction has taken place. It's only in cases where there are more serious concerns and in those situations where I've not been able to resolve the situation informally that are reported to the Standards Committee for awareness, assurance and deterrence. On the other hand, we have the Monitoring Officer Referrals Procedure under the Complaints Procedure, and this process is used extremely infrequently. And so for context, I've used it once in my tenure as the Monitoring Officer, and it's reserved for the most serious potential misconduct. It's designed for situations where I become aware of potentially very serious misconduct, but a complaint has not been forthcoming, and it's deemed that it would not be in the public interest to wait and hope that a complaint came forward. It enables the committee then to determine whether a matter that has been raised with them warrants formal investigation, and in allowing that matter to be considered by the committee does provide a degree of protection for the monitoring officer. In the August 2025 case that I mentioned by way of introduction, that was a case relating to taxi licensing. When that matter was flagged with myself, I carried out a preliminary investigation and secured an informal resolution prior to committee consideration. When committee considered that, members noted that this was consistent with the taxi licensing process, but different to that wider complaints procedure. So, as officers, we have considered the two processes, and we consider that aligning the two processes could provide greater clarity and consistency for members and officers, and a better balance between early informal resolution with democratic oversight. So committee is invited to offer a view on your preferred approach to alignment, if you have one, and also to consider whether it would be appropriate to introduce a threshold test for monitoring officer referrals. So I did say that it's a procedure which is invoked very infrequently, and I consider it to only be appropriate for use with the most serious case of misconduct. So it may be that committee feels that you would like officers to go away and consider whether a threshold test could be proposed for when that procedure is invoked. Subject to committee's view, a delegated authority is sought for myself as monitoring officer in consultation with you, Chair, to agree any necessary amendments to the procedure and to take that for referral to full council for approval.
Personally, I think that if anything of standards, if anything was flagged by the taxi service or the licensing service, it would probably be of a certain level of severity anyway. If it, you made that call, it probably wouldn't align with some of the most serious offences that a councillor could make, and it might be lower than that normal threshold. But so yeah, some kind of threshold system might be in place, but I think the bar would perhaps be slightly lower, or in that instance, because it's reached a certain level of severity, it just might, it's affected differently, it's handled differently. But,
yeah, Chair, I would suggest that at the minute, where the behaviours that are say infrequently, occasionally reported to the licensing team, are instances which have on the face of them are potentially breaches of the code, but do, as I say, tend to relate more to fairly low-level breaches. So they're more about, as I say, approach, tone, kind of things which can be addressed quite effectively through an informal resolution.
Any comments? Yeah, Shiraz.
Thank you, Chair. This was part of a plan that was brought in, I don't know, 9-10 years ago, whatever. And most of that plan, to be honest with you, has made Derby worse in everything that was supposed to make it better. It's had the adverse effect on it. Now, you and I have sat in a planning control committee meeting. People from the gallery are shouting, "You've got a brown envelope, you've done this, we've done that." Officers are being called all sorts of things. Yet we have a process where if an officer or a councillor, have a go at each other, that one or both or either can make a complaint to the monitoring officer in regards to it. I don't see why a department should have specific rules for it. General licensing doesn't have one. Planning and control don't have one. But licensing, this should not be an agenda item, in my opinion, because we have a set rule. This was, as I said, it was introduced when some terrible things were done, atrocious crimes were committed in an authority that's 1.5 to 2 hours drive from here. It's had no, and I think Alan was around in them days, 8-9 years ago when it was introduced. It was basically a deterrence to councillors. You shouldn't do this. And I said then, I will make as many inquiries as I want if they're genuine, and anybody from my ward asks me. The fact that I've only probably made 3 in 10 years is irrelevant. We are elected members. If somebody comes and asks us to make an inquiry, we should do it. Why does a councillor, who acts on behalf of a resident be penalised for, making it, or to be frightened? Now, if you just let me finish.
Well, I think we need to just tackle that point, because every councillor is perfectly able to make an inquiry on behalf of the residents with no comeback, no problem.
No, it wasn't, the chair, with all due respect, you wasn't around when this was introduced. And there were cases when people were just making an inquiry of the, what I'm trying to say is this gave enforcement officers a protection they didn't need. And they were able to do things which they probably won't have done if they knew that there was going to be a check and balance. Now, I don't see, as I said, our officers from trading standards, food and hygiene, etc., going to very dangerous places on their own. They don't have this kind of protection. Yet a licensing officer is saying, well, somebody made an inquiry, I'm frightened. Well, why are you frightened? If you're right, then you shouldn't be frightened. And if you are wrong, then and a elected member asks a question, the member deserves an answer because his resident, his constituent is asking him. I've seen many cases simply because somebody can do something from the licensing department, they've done it. And the people that driver is approached, unfortunately, they were timid. Had they come to me, I would have asked the question. But these people said, no, I can't. I've been told councillors can't make inquiries. This has been misused. This has been abused.
I don't think any councillor has been told they can't make inquiries of the licensing team. And I don't think it's an issue. If somebody contacted me, I would contact the licensing team tomorrow. I don't think there's any reason to be scared of dealing with the licensing team. And if there is, then there is a problem. But I don't think it's with these rules, because these rules are quite clear.
Well, look, this report has been brought to clarify things. Why? Because I've been asking for things. What are we, penalising councillors for?
We're not penalising councillors unless councillors overstep the mark. That's the point.
Look, this report is sent to the full council. This report is actually gathered, sent to the full council saying this number of, inquiries have been made. why? That's what I want to know. Why is it that we don't hear from anybody in the planning department, in general licensing, or in any other way, right? This should not be a stick. But if a councillor makes an inquiry, then he has a right to make so. But I mean, now we're trying to clarify after 10 years introduction, we're now trying to clarify what's the threshold.
What we're trying to do here is make sure that our complaints procedure is consistent. Okay. At the moment, we have two different systems or two different elements to it, which are not consistent and not clear. That's all we're trying to do. Now, if the councillor gets involved with the licensing team, that is fine. Occasionally, councillors overstep the mark because of interest, right? And that sometimes happens, and that is wrong. And this is to safeguard councillors from abusing their position in the council. In the same way that if my bin is missed, right, if I phone the bin team and say, "Oh, you get my bin sorted," it might be unsuitable for me to do so, particularly if I live in a different ward.
I don't think that took 10 years to decide whether it's the threshold or not. We're talking about this, which I've been raising at every meeting. I've been saying this is wrong, and after 10 years, we decided to look at what the threshold is of it.
Should I just clarify? Yeah. I'm not suggesting that there is a threshold for reviewing interactions with licensing committee, licensing officers introduced. The threshold is in relation to the monitoring officer referrals process, which is the process that is where I become aware of potentially very serious misconduct, but no complaint is made. But I feel that it is in the public interest that that behaviour is considered by this committee.
It's at what level you raise that into a complaint. Yes. That's the threshold we're talking about. Not
in relation to the licensing.
And then that level means that it can then be dealt with according to our complaints procedure. And 99% of the cases, that threshold will not be met and no complaint will occur. But occasionally it has been that a complaint has been required or it's had to be handled. And what we're trying to do is say, or what I would like to see, and what we voted on in the past was, it needs to be consistent with our complaints procedure, as opposed to at the moment an ad hoc complaints or a different complaints procedure.
Well, as I said, I welcome it now, that we have some form of clarity, but even now, and Emily will correct me if I'm wrong, that any councillor who makes an inquiry, I mean, that's logged. But it is not logged anywhere else.
But nothing comes with that log. It's a safeguard. It's not a red mark.
All I want to know is what's so special that we have to treat it this way as opposed to general licensing or planning.
I think it's because it's been abused in the past. Now, Alex will.
Yeah, I think councillors, the report, there's a hyperlink to the 2016 public interest report, and there's quite a lengthy section in that report around taxi licensing and the incidents that led to these recommendations being made. Now, that was a reflection of where the council was at that time, and I'm pleased to say that the measures that the full council and the standards committee at the time took have meant that actually the types of referrals that we're talking about are very few and far between. I agree with what Emily has, but I need to be clear that those instances and case studies that are detailed in that public interest report were very serious and they required robust action. I agree with what Emily has said previously. That threshold test around monitoring officer referrals, I think, is important because, if being completely candid with councillors, the code of conduct says that councillors must treat others with respect. Now, on a relatively regular basis, we receive contact from colleagues around the organisation who might feel that they haven't been treated respectfully. And quite often that can be down to misunderstanding. It can be down to choice of words in an email, low level incidents that can be easily resolved. I'm sure, the committee wouldn't want to see Emily bringing that forward as a referral, a monitoring officer referral for something that is it's not that it's not important, but it's a minor breach of the code, rather than those things that create a more fundamental risk to the robustness of the council's processes or create other risks for the local authority. But as I said, just to return to my initial point, would encourage all councillors and independent persons to reread the section in the public interest report specifically related to taxi licensing, which does set the context in which these measures were introduced.
Any desperate comments from anybody? But I've got one concern here, which is that 2.2, the recommendation is to delegate authority to Emily and myself. And there are only 2 other councillors in the room, so I would end up voting for it to delegate to me, which is fine, but it may be that we want to wait until there's another 2 here if this is contentious. Yeah.
As an alternative, we can work up an amendment to the code of conduct and bring it back to the next meeting. It's just
if we work it up between us or whatever, and we'll bring it back next time, and hopefully there'll be more people here to agree the amendment here rather than delay it. I agree that's a good course of action. Because it's just that I know that I hold quite a bit of power in that, being the chair and the vote and the extra vote, and obviously you're not happy with it. So let's do it that way. Okay.
Yeah, well, thank you, Chair.
Helpful? Okay. All done on 7 then. Right, okay. Section 8, the volume and outcomes of complaints 24, 25, 25, 26.
So, thank you, Chair. Oh, sorry, my agenda is closed. I was going straight on to item 9. What's that?
I've misnumbered the notes.
You misnumbered.
I was all confused. Thank you, changed suddenly. Yeah, sorry, I was sort of, there's a report I'm not aware of. Sorry, it doesn't take much.
I was doing it on paper.
So, yes, thank you, Chair. So, the details of complaints received across the municipal years 23-24, 24-25 are attached to appendices 3 and 4 to this report. I'm pleased to report to committee that at the time of at this current time, we have no live complaints following the recent closure of complaints 0524 and 0624. We have thought we might get to this position in the past where we've had no live complaints at the point of agenda publication, but a complaint has come in before the meeting has started. So this is quite a novel position for us to be in. So we have received 6 complaints so far in this municipal year, 3 of which have been dismissed on the basis that even if proven they would not represent a breach of the council's code of conduct, and 3 of which have been dismissed as the subject member was not acting in their capacity as a councillor at the time. There is an opportunity for the committee to ask questions about the nature of the resolutions in the front part of the meeting. So, and it's also just to point out that the table in relation to council complaints is always available on the Democracy portal for public inspection and is updated monthly.
Okay, anything on that point? No. So we're just straight on to excluding the press and public, I believe. Sorry.
Is the one regarding the supermarket now closed?
We'll get on to stuff afterwards.
Because I
I
keep getting asked about that one everywhere I go.
We'll get on to that shortly. I think it's probably the best way of handling
Right.
that.
We're going to exclusion.
We're going to exclusion of press and public. And I'm not going to read all that because you said I don't have to.
You don't,
Really?
as long as the committee moves the resolution.
We're
to
going
exclude the press.
No, we're going to make you read it. Stop Emily from leaving.
You said I don't have to read it. Every time somebody does it, makes me giggle now.
I've always thought it was unnecessary.